Una entered the cargo bay through a side door and immediately drew the attention of every Vorthik in the room. They turned their weapons toward her, and their squad leader laughed when he saw what stood before him. "This is what the coalition sends against us," he said. "And a single wounded human who can barely stand. I am enough." Una replied. She fired twice and killed the 2 Vorthik nearest to the escape pods. And then she ran not toward safety, not toward cover. She ran toward the center of the room where she would draw every eye and every weapon away from the doors. Where the survivors would enter, the Vorthik opened fire, and Una dove behind a stack of cargo containers as energy bolts burned the air around her. "Get to the pods," she screamed. "And go now." Krandorth burst through the doors with Ambassador Delacroix over one shoulder and Tyrus Van close behind. And the other survivors followed in a desperate rush toward the escape pods. The Vorthik turned to intercept them, but Una rose from her cover and shot 2 more in the back. "I am your enemy," she shouted. "And face me, if you dare." The squad leader roared with fury and charged toward her position with his blade. Drawn, Una met him head-on. She was smaller and weaker and broken in a dozen different ways. And she fought him anyway. His blade cut across her chest and opened a wound that would have killed a lesser being. And she grabbed his arm and pulled herself close enough to press her weapon against his face. She pulled the trigger, and his head disappeared in a flash of light, but his body fell on top of her and pinned her to the ground. And the remaining Vorthik surrounded her with their weapons aimed at her bleeding form. "Get to the pods," she screamed again. "And do not stop." Tyrus Van was at the door of the nearest escape pod when they looked back and saw Una trapped beneath the dead squad leader. The other survivors were already inside, and Krandorth was calling for the shale to enter, but Tyrus Van could not move. They watched as Una pushed the body off of herself with arms that should not have had any strength left. And they watched as she crawled across the floor toward the control panel on the far wall. The Vorthik watched her too, and they laughed at her slow, desperate progress. "Let her crawl," one of them said, "and we will kill her after we capture the others." They turned toward the escape pods. Where the doors were closing, Una reached the control panel. She pulled herself up using the console for support, and her blood smeared across the buttons as she entered the activation sequence. The Vorthik realized what she was doing at the last moment. "Stop." "Huh." The ranking soldier screamed, but it was too late. Una pressed the final button and smiled. "Goodbye," she said. The cargo bay doors exploded outward, and the atmosphere rushed into the void of space with a roar that swallowed every other sound. The Vorthik were torn from their feet and pulled toward the breach like leaves in a hurricane, and their screams were lost in the howling wind. Una wrapped her arms around a support beam and held on. The force of the decompression was immense, and it pulled at her broken body with fingers of ice and vacuum. And she felt her skin beginning to freeze and her lungs beginning to burn as the air was ripped from her chest. She held on 13 seconds. That was how long the emergency systems needed to detect the breach and seal it. 13 seconds of vacuum and cold, and the crushing weight of her own damaged body trying to tear itself apart. Una held on for every single one of those seconds. When the emergency bulkheads finally slammed shut, an atmosphere began to flood back into the cargo bay. She fell to the floor and did not move. A Tyrus Van was out of the escape pod before it had fully pressurized, and they ran across the cargo bay to where Una lay in a pool of her own blood. "Human," they said as they knelt beside her. And Una, and please respond. There was no response. Tyrus Van touched her for the first time, pressing their crystal fingers against her throat to search for a pulse. Nothing. And then a flutter, weak and irregular, but present. Una Park was alive. "She is alive," Tyrus Van shouted. and we need medical assistance immediately. Krondorth emerged from the escape pod and crossed the cargo bay in 3 massive strides. And he lifted Yuna's broken body as gently as if she were made of glass. "Get the pods ready for launch," he said, "and we will take her with us." The escape pods launched just as Coalition rescue ships arrived in the system. And the Vorthic raiders fled rather than face a battle they could not win on board the rescue. Ship Yuna was taken by human medics who worked with desperate speed to repair the damage that should have killed her hours. Agat Tyresvan watched through the medical bay windows and recorded everything. 3 weeks later, the Shale researcher published their paper on human biology. It was titled Humans, a study in misleading fragility, and it changed how the entire coalition viewed the species that they had dismissed as soft and weak. The conclusion of the paper spread across 100 worlds and was translated into 1,000 languages. Humans are not fragile, it read, and they are simply willing to break themselves so that others will not have to. 6 months after the attack, Yuna Park returned to active duty with scars that crossed her body like a map of her server. Valteris Vaughn visited her on her first day back and found her standing at a window, looking out at the stars. "Why did you do it?" the Shale asked. "And why did you risk everything for people who called you fragile and weak?" Yuna turned to face them, and her eyes were the same as they had been on that terrible day, calm and steady and ready for whatever came next. "Because you were under my protection," she said. "And because that is what humans do." Tyresvan understood then that they had been wrong about everything. Humans were not the weakest species in the galaxy. They were the strongest, because strength was never about armor or weapons or the ability to survive without damage. Strength was about the will to keep going when everything said you should stop. And no species in the galaxy had more of that than humanity. The service corridor was narrow and dark and filled with pipes that hissed with steam and cables that sparked with electricity. And Tyresvan moved through it with the other survivors, while their mind kept returning to the image of the human standing alone behind them. The sound of weapons fire continued, and each shot told them that Yuna was still fighting, still alive, still refusing to stop. Krondorth led the group with his massive body barely fitting through the cramped passage, and his forearms pushed aside debris and tore through obstacles that would have stopped the others. "We must move faster," he growled, "and the human is buying us time that we cannot waste." Ambassador Delacroix stumbled and nearly fell, and a Kethrani helped steady him with their many legs. "How much further to the escape pods?" the ambassador asked. "2 more sections," Krondorth answered, "and then we must cross the main cargo bay." Tyresvan accessed the station's damaged computer network through their internal systems and found information that made their crystal body flicker with distress. "The cargo bay is occupied," they announced, "and Vorthic forces have established a position there to control access to the escape pods." "How many?" Krondorth demanded. "At least 12 soldiers," Tyresvan replied, "and they have heavy weapons." The corridor fell silent, except for the distant sounds of battle that still echoed from behind them. "We cannot fight 12 Vorthic," a Kethrani said, "and we should find another route." "There is no other route," Tyresvan said, "and all other paths to the escape pods have been sealed or destroyed." Krondorth slammed one of his fists against the wall in frustration. "Then we will have to fight," he said, "and we will lose, but we will fight." "Wait," Tyresvan said as new information appeared in their sensors, "and someone is approaching from behind us." The group turned to face the darkness of the corridor behind them, and weapons were raised by those who had theme. Figure emerged from the shadows covered in blood and moving with a limping gait that spoke of terrible injuries. It was Yunash. Was Oliva. Krondorth stared at her with an expression that might have been disbelief or might have been awe. "How?" he asked. And how are you still standing? Una leaned against the wall and took several shallow breaths that made wet sounds in her damaged chest. I told you, she said, and humans are hard to kill. Tyresvan scanned her body and found a catalog of injuries that should have been fatal several times over. 3 broken ribs with one of them puncturing her luna. Deep laceration across her arm that had severed several important blood vessels, a gunshot wound through her shoulder that had missed her heart by less than 2 centimeters, dozens of smaller cuts and bruises and burns, and blood loss that had already exceeded what should be survivable for a human. You should be dead. Tyresvan said, probably, Una agreed. But I'm not dead yet, so let us keep moving. She pushed herself off the wall and walked past the stunned aliens toward the front of the group. 12 Vorthik in the cargo bay, she said, and I heard your conversation through the walls. You cannot fight in your condition. Krondorith said, I cannot do a lot of things in my condition. Una replied, but I am going to do them anyway. She reached into a pouch on her belt and pulled out a small medical kit that she had taken from one of the dead Vorthik. Inside was a stimulant designed for Vorthik biology, and she studied it for a moment before injecting it into her neck. The effect was immediate and violent. Her body convulsed, and her veins stood out against her skin like cables, and her eyes went wide with a pain that she did not allow to reach her voice. That was meant for Vorthik, Tyresvan said with alarm, and it could kill you. It could. Una agreed as her shaking stopped and her breathing steadied. But it has not killed me yet, so let us use the time it has given me. She moved to the front of the group and looked through a gap in the wall that showed the cargo bay beyond the Vorthik were there just as Tyresvan had said, and they were positioned around the escape pods with weapons ready. I have a plan, Una said, but I need your help. What kind of plan? Krondorith asked. Do you see that control panel on the far wall? Una asked, and the one next to the atmospheric systems. Yes. That panel controls the emergency venting for this section. Una explained, and if someone activates it, then the cargo bay will decompress and the Vorthik will be pulled out into space. But so will everyone else in the cargo bay. Tyresvan observed. Yes, Una said, and that is why the panel needs to be activated from inside the cargo bay while everyone else is safe in the escape pods. Silence fell over the group as they understood what she was saying. You are proposing to sacrifice yourself. Krondorith said, I am proposing to complete my mission. Una corrected. And my mission is to protect Ambassador Dalacraw, and this is how I protect him. There must be another way. Tyresvan said, There is not another way, Una replied. And even if there was, we do not have time to find it, and the Vorthik reinforcements will be here soon, and then none of us will escape. She looked at each of them in turn, and her eyes lingered longest on Tyresvan. I need you to get everyone to the pods, she said. And when I create a distraction, you run for the pods and you do not stop for anything. And when you are inside, you launch immediately. And what about you? Tyresvan asked. Una smiled again, and this time it was not terrible, it was sad. I told you before, she said, and humans are hard to kill. She did not wait for them to respond. She turned and walked toward the cargo bay with her weapon raised and her broken body held upright by nothing but will and stimulants, and something that Tyresvan could not name. The shale researcher watched her go and felt something crack inside their crystal heart. The first Vorthik through the door was massive and covered in powered armor that hummed with deadly energy, and his weapon was already firing before his feet touched the ground. Una moved. She did not move like the Kethrani, who were fast but predictable, and she did not move like the Gorvath, who were powerful but slow. She moved like water flowing around stone, and she was already in a different position before the Vorthik could adjust his aim. Her first shot took him in the joint, where his helmet met his neck armor, and the energy bolt burned through the seal and dropped him to the floor. The Payif second Vorthik roared and swung a massive blade at her head. And Una ducked beneath it and grabbed a metal chair leg from the debris around Hirsch, drove it into the gap beneath his arm plate, where the armor was weakest. And she twisted it and felt something give way inside. The Vorthik screamed and stumbled backward. And Una shot him twice in the face. Tyrus Van recorded everything with sensors that were designed to capture the finest details. And what they captured made no sense according to everything they knew about human biology. The human was not supposed to be able to move like this. The human was not supposed to be able to fight like this. The human was supposed to be fragile. A third Vorthik caught Una with a backhand blow that sent her crashing into an overturned table, and the sound of cracking ribs echoed through the room. She hit the ground hard and blood sprayed from her mouth, and she should have stayed down. She did not stay down. Una rose to her feet with one arm wrapped around her broken ribs and her weapon still clutched in her other hand, and she shot the Vorthik who had hit her through his left eye. "What is happening?" a Kethrani whispered from behind the barriers. "And why is she still standing?" "I do not know," Tyrus Van answered. "And I truly do not know." More Vorthik poured through the breach, and Una met them with a fury that seemed impossible for her small, broken body. She fought with no grace and no beauty and no elegance. Fought like a wounded animal that refused to accept its own death. A blade sliced across her arm and opened a deep gash that poured red blood onto the white floor. And she used the same arm to block the next strike and drive her chair leg into her attacker's throat. A shot burned through her shoulder and spun her around. And she used the momentum to bring her weapon up and fire 3 times into the cluster of enemies behind her. She fell and rose and fell again and rose again. And each time she rose there was more blood and more damage and more reasons why she should not be able to continue. But she continued. Krendorth watched with eyes that grew wider with each passing moment. And he had fought many battles in his long life, but he had never seen anything like this. The human was being destroyed piece by piece before his eyes, and she simply refused to acknowledge it. "This is impossible," he said. "No," Tyrus Van replied with a voice that trembled. "And this is human." Una killed another Vorthik by jamming her weapon under his chin and pulling the trigger. And his head snapped back and he collapsed on top of her. She pushed his body aside and stood up on legs that shook with exhaustion and blood loss. 7 Vorthik lay dead around Hirsch. She had killed 7 enemies in powered armor with nothing but a sidearm and a chair leg. And she had done it while sustaining injuries that would have incapacitated any other species in the room. The remaining Vorthik hesitated at the breach. They had expected easy prey and soft targets and a quick capture of valuable hostages. They had not expected this. Their targeting systems showed the humans vital signs, and the data made no sense. Because she should be unconscious or dead, but she was neither. She was standing in the middle of the room covered in her own blood and the blood of their fallen comrades, and she was raising her weapon again with hands that should not have been able to hold anything. "Come on," she said in a voice that was rough with pain. "And I am still here." The Vorthik squad leader spoke into his communicator and requested reinforcements. And his voice was not as steady as it should have been. Una heard the request and knew what it meant. More were coming, many more. She turned to look at the aliens huddled behind the barriers, and her eyes found Tyrus Van. "You need to go," she said. "And there is a service corridor behind the far wall that leads to the escape pod bay." "How do you know this?" Tyrus Van asked. "I studied the layout," Una repeated. "And now go." "What about you?" Una smiled, and it was a terrible thing to see on her bloody face. "Someone needs to hold them here," she said. "And someone needs to buy you time to reach the pods. You will die," Krondora said. "Maybe," Una admitted, "and maybe not. And humans are hard to kill." She turned back toward the breach where shadows were already moving as more Vorthik prepared to assault the room. "Go now," she said, "and protect the ambassador and get everyone to the escape pods." Tyresvan found that they could not move, and they were frozen in place by the sight of this small broken creature preparing to sacrifice herself for people who had mocked her and dismissed her and called her fragile. "Why?" the Shale asked. "And why would you do this for us?" Yuna did not turn around. "Because you are under my protection," she said. "And that is what protection means." She raised her weapon and faced the darkness. "Beyond the breach. Now go." Krandorith grabbed Tyresvan and pulled them toward the far wall where others were, already working to open the service corridor. The last thing the Shale researchers saw before the wall. Close behind them was Una Park standing alone in a room full of bodies. She was broken and bleeding and barely able to stand, and she was smiling. The station rocked again as something massive collided with the outer hull, and Una grabbed a nearby railing to keep her balance while aliens stumbled and fell around her. Through the observation windows, she could see ships emerging from the darkness like sharks rising from deep water, and their hulls were painted black with red markings that she recognized immediately. Vorth raiders. "This was planned," she said quietly. And then she was moving across the chamber toward Ambassador Dalacrata. Kathrani were scattering in every direction with their legs, clicking against the floor in a frenzy of panic. And the Gorvath were curling into defensive balls with their armored plates locking together like living fortresses. And the Shale were emitting high-pitched frequencies that made Una's teeth ache. Only the humans in the room were moving with purpose. "Ambassador," Una said as she reached Delacroix, "we need to get you to the secure wing now." "What about the others?" Delacroix asked. "They can follow if they want to live." Tyresvan watched the human female take control of the situation with an efficiency that seemed impossible for such a fragile creature. And they found themselves moving closer to hear what she was saying. "Everyone listen to me," Una shouted in a voice that cut through the chaos like a blade. "And listen carefully because I will not repeat myself." The aliens fell silent and turned to look at her with expressions ranging from confusion to contempt. "Vorthik boarding parties will breach this section within minutes," Una continued. "And when they do, they will kill anyone who resists and capture anyone who might be valuable. And that means everyone in this room is either a target or a corpse. How dare you give us orders?" Krandorith growled as he uncurled from his defensive position. "And what can a soft little human do against Vorthik shock troops? More than you will do hiding inside your shell," Una replied without hesitation. "And now follow me or die here, and I do not care which one you choose." She turned and walked toward the doors that led to the secure wing. And Ambassador Delacroix followed her without question. Tyresvan found themselves moving as well. And they were not entirely sure why one by one the other aliens began to follow. Drawn by something in the human's voice that they could not identify but could not ignore, Krandorith was the last to move. And his massive form trembled with anger as he walked behind the small human who had dared to speak to him with such disrespect. The corridors were filled with flashing red lights and the sound of distant explosions. And Una led the group through the maze of passages with a confidence that suggested she had memorized every turn. "How do you know where you are going?" Tyresvan asked. "I studied the station layout before we arrived," Una answered, "and I always study the layout." "Why?" "Because I always assume something will go wrong." They reached the secure wing, and Una sealed the doors behind them with a code that she had obtained from station security. 3 days earlier, the conference room they entered was large and well-furnished with thick walls designed to withstand moderate weapons fire. But Una knew it would not hold against a determined assault. "This will not protect us," Krandorith said, echoing her thoughts. "And the Vorthik will cut through these walls like paper." Then we need to make sure they never reach the walls. Yuna replied. She began moving furniture with quick, efficient motions. And she pushed tables onto their sides to create barriers and positioned chairs to funnel any attackers into narrow channels. "What are you doing?" Akethrani asked. "Creating kill zones," Yuna answered. "And I need everyone to help. Kill zones," Tyrus-Van repeated with fascination. "And you intend to fight them?" "I intend to slow them down until rescue arrives." "But you are human," the Shale said. "And humans are the most fragile species in the coalition. And how can you possibly fight Vorthic soldiers in powered armor?" Yuna stopped what she was doing and turned to face the alien researcher. "Let me explain something to you," she said in a voice that was calm and cold. "And I want you to remember it." She took a step closer to Tyrus-Van, and the crystalline being found themselves taking a step back. "Humans did not become the dominant species on our world because we were the strongest, or the fastest, or the most armored," Yuna said. "And we became dominant because we refused to stop, and we refused to give up. And we refused to accept that we could not win." "That is not logical," Tyrus-Van said. "No," Yuna agreed. "And it is not logical at all, and that is exactly why it works." The sound of weapons fire echoed through the corridors outside, and Yuna drew her sidearm and checked the charge. "They are coming," she said. "And everyone get behind the barriers and stay down." Krondorth moved to stand beside her with his massive fists clenched. "I will not hide behind furniture while a human fights." "My battles," he said. "Then stand with me," Yuna replied. "But stay behind me until I tell you to move." "Why should I take orders from you?" "Because I have fought before, and I have killed before, and I know what I am doing." The Gorvath stared at her for a long moment. And then he nodded slowly. "Very well, human," he said. "And show me what your fragile species can do." The doors at the far end of the wing began to glow red as cutting torches burned through the metal. And Yuna raised her weapon and aimed at the center of the growing circle of heat. "Everyone stay calm," she said. "And stay quiet, and do exactly what I tell you." Tyrus-Van activated every recording sensor in their body, because they knew they were about to witness something significant. Human female stood before them with her small weapon raised and her soft body completely exposed. And she should have been terrified, but her hands were steady and her breathing was controlled, and her eyes were fixed on the door with an intensity that made the Shale researcher feel something they had never felt before. The door exploded inward and Vorthic shock troops poured through the opening with weapons blazing. Yuna stepped forward to meet them alone. The observation station hung in the darkness of space like a jewel made of glass and steel. Inside its curved halls, dozens of alien species had gathered for what they called the summit of lasting peace. Yuna Park stood near them, back at the grand conference chamber with her hands folded behind her back and her eyes moving slowly across every corner of the room. And she counted the exits and measured the distance to each one without anyone noticing what she was doing. She was a security attaché assigned to protect Ambassador Dalacroche during these negotiations between the Galactic Coalition and the Vorthic Dominion. And it was not a glamorous job. But Yuna had never cared about glamour. The chamber was filled with beings that towered over her small human frame, and she had grown used to the way they looked at her with something between pity and amusement. Near the central table, a group of Shale delegates stood in a cluster of shimmering crystal bodies that caught the light and scattered it into rainbows across the walls. And one of them had been watching Yuna for the past hour with an intensity that made her skin prickle. The Shale was called Tyrus-Van, and they were a researcher who had joined the diplomatic mission to study the various species present. And humans had become their primary subject of fascination. "Observe the human security officer," Tyrus-Van said quietly to a colleague, their voice like wind chimes in a gentle breeze. And notice how she positions herself near structural supports rather than open spaces. Why does that matter? The colleague asked. I do not know yet, Tyrus Van admitted. But I intend to find out. Across the chamber, a massive Gorvath warrior named Krondorth let out a rumbling laugh that shook the floor beneath Yuna's feet. And she glanced toward him without turning her head. The Gorvath were enormous creatures covered in natural armor that could stop most weapons. And they stood nearly 3 meters tall with 4 arms and faces like slabs of carved stone. The coalition sends a human to guard their ambassador, Krondorth said to his companions. And this is supposed to make us feel safe. Perhaps she is meant to fetch drinks, another Gorvath suggested. And they all laughed again. Yuna's expression did not change. And she continued her silent observation of the room, as if she had not heard them at all. A group of Kethrani skittered past her on their many legs, their insectoid bodies clicking and buzzing as they communicated in their own language. And one of them paused to look at her with compound eyes that reflected her image 1,000 times. Soft skin, the Kethrani observed, and no claws or venom or armor of any kind. And I wonder how humans survived long enough to reach the stars. They are clever with tools, another Kethrani replied. But cleverness cannot stop a blade or a bullet. Yuna remained still and silent, and only her eyes moved as she tracked the Vorthic delegation entering through the far doors. Vorthic were tall and lean with gray skin stretched tight over sharp bones, and their eyes were solid black orbs that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. And they moved with the confidence of predators who had never known fear. Their leader was a diplomat named Sornvek, and he walked to the central table with a smile that showed too many teeth. We thank the coalition for this opportunity to discuss peace, Sornvek said, and his voice was smooth like oil on water. Though we wonder if peace is truly possible between hunters and prey. Ambassador Delacroix rose from his seat to respond, and Yuna shifted her weight slightly to the balls of her feet without conscious thought. The coalition believes that all sapient species can find common ground, Delacroix said calmly. And we hope the Dominion shares this belief. Hope is a fragile thing, Sornvek replied. Much like your human protector standing in the shadows. And I wonder what she could possibly do if something were to go wrong. Every alien in the room turned to look at Yuna, and she met their gazes without flinching. Tyrus Van recorded everything with sensors built into their crystalline body, and they noted that the human's heart rate had increased slightly, but her breathing remained steady and controlled. The human species is perhaps the most fragile in the coalition, Tyrus Van murmured into their recording device. With skin that tears easily and bones that break under moderate pressure, and a lifespan that barely exceeds 100 cycles. And yet they insist on placing themselves in dangerous positions. And I cannot determine if this is courage or stupidity. The negotiations continued for hours, and tensions rose with every exchange of words. The Vorthic made demands that the coalition could not accept, and the coalition made offers that the Vorthic rejected with contempt. And through it all, Yuna stood in her corner and watched and waited. She noticed things that others missed because they were too focused on the words being spoken. She noticed that the Vorthic security officers were not standing in defensive positions, but in positions that would allow them to reach the exits quickly. She noticed that Sornvek kept glancing at a device on his wrist as if waiting for a signal. She noticed that one of the Vorthic guards had a weapon that was not standard issue, something heavier and more powerful than what a diplomatic security team would normally carry. And did not report these observations to anyone because she had learned long ago that aliens rarely listened to human concerns. Instead, she memorized the layout of the room and identified the best routes to evacuate the ambassador if something went wrong. When the negotiations finally ended for the day, Sornvek stood and bowed with exaggerated politeness. We will consider your proposals, he said. "But I warn you that the Dominion's patience is not unlimited. And those who test us often regret their choices." He turned and walked out with his delegation following close behind. And the chamber fell into uneasy silence. "That was a threat," Krondorith growled. "And we should not let it stand. It was a negotiating tactic," Ambassador Delacroix replied wearily. "And we must remain calm if we want peace." Una said nothing, but her instincts were screaming that something was very wrong. Tyrus Van approached her with careful steps, their crystal body chiming softly with each movement. "Human," they said, "I am curious about your species, and I wonder if you would answer some questions for my research." "What kind of questions?" Una asked without looking at them. "I wish to understand why humans place themselves in danger when you are so poorly equipped to survive it." Before Una could answer, the station shuddered beneath their feet, and the lights flickered and turned red. A sound like thunder rolled through the walls. And then the alarms began to scream, warning. The station's automated voice announced, "Multiple unidentified vessels have exited hyperspace in hostile formation, and all personnel should proceed to emergency stations immediately." Una's hand went to her sidearm, and her heart began to pound harder in her chest. Tyrus Van watched her with fascination and noticed something strange in the human's eyes. It was not fear, it was something else entirely. Something that made the crystalline researcher feel an unfamiliar sensation of uneasy. Una Park was not afraid of what was coming. She was ready for it.